A very good evening on behalf of Raza Foundation and the India Habitat Center, with whose collaboration we have been organizing this memorial lecture series. We chose 7 masters in whose memory we have instituted this lecture series, and we are inviting some of the most creative, dynamic, critical minds from all over the country to deliver these lectures, and hoping that these lectures will be a substantial contribution to thinking about various arts. We have had a Kumar Gandhar Memorial Lecture by Mukund Lat. We had Manikol Memorial Lecture by Kumar Shahani. We had V.S. Gaitonde Memorial Lecture by Prabhakar Kolte. Next month we have Dayakrishna Memorial Lecture by Ananya Vajpayee. And in April 4th we have a gay memorial lecture by the Gujarati poet Sitanshu Yashas Chandra. The Kelucharan Mahapatra Memorial Lecture is to be delivered by Dr. Padma Subramaniam, and somehow we are not able to fix a date which suits her, the India Habitat Center, and us in that order. Raza Foundation was created by Raza Sahab, who is here, and it is devoted to arts, literature, poetry, culture, etc. Hopefully, very soon, we'll be launching 2 new journals. One in Hindi already takes place, which is devoted to literature and civilization, called Samas, which is edited by Udayan Vajpayee and published from Bhopal. The 2 journals which have to come up soon, one in English called Aroop, which is devoted to abstraction in visual arts, architecture, philosophy, music, cinema, dance, etc. And then we are starting a new journal in Hindi devoted to classical music and classical dance called Swar Mudra, to be edited by Prerna Shimali and Yatindra Mishra. We're also starting soon another series called The Art Critic. Practitioners are celebrated and looked at critically, but the art critics who usually do this work never get celebrated nor looked at critically. So we thought we should start a series, and we are hoping that we will be able to cover art critics like Geeta Kapoor, B.N. Goswami, Yashodhara Dalmia, etc. Habib Tanvir was a senior friend to me, kind of a mentor, and was also very well known to Raza Sahab. What Habib Tanvir did in theatre, people who are here would know. There was a time when his Agra Bazaar used to start with a verse by Nazir Akhbarabadi, which used to be in the praise of Ganesh, and it used to finish Mahima uski bhi rahe jiska naam Ganesh. So I had played upon it and wrote a piece in which I called कि महिमा उसकी रहेगी जिसका नाम Habib. And I think in the 20th century in India, he was one of the makers of modern Indian theatre, along with other people like Ibrahim Al-Qazi, Shambhu Mitra, B.V. Karant, etc. And I think he brought to theatre a certain sensibility and a certain technique which was so unique and so different from the more dominant. To see Chhattisgarhi performers taking to so-called modern expression so spontaneously, and so Chhattisgarhi, after all, is one of the dialects of Hindi. Out of 46 dialects is one of them. He is the only one who kept on doing this great theatre in a dialect of Hindi and made it acceptable almost universally. And he was pioneer, therefore I need not say anything more. Sadanand Menon, whom we have called arts critic, if you have noticed, the apostrophe is after the S, because he writes, when you say somebody is an art critic, it usually means the visual arts critic. But he has been writing about dance, he is writing about theatre, he has written about cinema, he has written about music. So he is an old friend and one of the finest critical minds in this country on the performing arts in any case. So we are he had been to many places, so I hope he is not so tired as to push up the lecture, but he has been to Kochi and he has been to Calcutta and Jadavpur and all over the place. So here it is, Sadanand Menon talking to you about theatre and violence. Most of the times we think of performing arts in this country as being celebrative, as being conservative, as being trying to remain within the limits. It's rarely that we think of the performing arts violating, exceeding their mandate, as it were, which is the popular mandate or the accepted critical mandate. So I'm also curious, as you are, to listen to Sadanand Menon on theatre and violence deliver the inaugural lecture of the Habib Tanvir Memorial Lecture Series. Sadanand Menon, and may I greet you with some flowers.
Good evening. This is certainly an emotional moment for me to be standing here next to the banner that proclaims the name of Habib Tanvir. It was a friendship and comradeship of over 35 years with him that I cherished and from which I learnt incessantly. Habib was forever a teacher and a player. He always prided himself in the fact that he was a teacher, and he narrated to us once a very interesting story of walking into a friend's house, and the friend was trying to teach his 5-year-old son how to count, and he was teaching him 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And the son was resisting. He didn't like to be taught and to be kind of straight-jacketed in that system. So he was protesting and he was crying and he was throwing his hands about, and the father was trying to catch him vigorously and hold him down and teach him. So when Habib walked into this house, this whole drama was going on, and Habib said, "Nahi, aise thodi padhate hain. There's other ways of doing this." So he took the child in his hand and he walked him up and down and he said, "Wo dekho bachcha, wo phool kaisa hai, wo dekho chidiya hai." And then he suddenly looked up at the ceiling, which was a tiled ceiling with, ballis and rafters and all that. And he said, "Dekho mane, kitni balliyan hai, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the child looks at him suspicious and says, "Uncle, मैं समझ गया, आप मुझे सिखा रहे हैं." So Habib said, that was one of the greatest lessons I learned early in my life. And I decided I will not do theatre in such a way that somebody will say, "Acha, aap hame sikha rahe ho." And that I think was a great sort of aspects of Habib's work. He was of course a communicator par excellence and was constantly on the lookout for devices in language, gesture, song and movement to reach out to his readership and his audiences, and to transform learning into fun and to transmit a radical consciousness without tears. Habib's brand of political theatre was never strident. He held informed and scathing views on socio-political issues of the time, but always sought a witty route to commenting on them. Rather than diatribe and direct redress, address, he sought satire, sarcasm, and ellipsis in language to expose the lies and hypocrisies of bourgeois society. Habib was ever bubbling with humor and ready playfulness and possessed the magic wand to transform serious critical political work to sustained play and amusement. Which is why the violent attacks on his plays by fundamentalist organizations during the last decade of his life constituted an interesting response. On the one hand, it suggested that through all the gentleness and ostensible suggestiveness of his playmaking strategy, the sharpness of his critique was registering and beginning to pinch. On the other hand, it was also a barometer of the troubling times, particularly the post-Babri Masjid demolition period, which unleashed a new form of street mob censorship and attack on the arts, which of course is now continuing, now escalating. We are seeing more and more production of that kind of street criticism, which the state, of course, caves into, the law and order machinery caves into, and it becomes like a generic form. And it's not very clear. I don't think social or political analysts are going to be easily able to analyze which direction this is going to go. But it seems like all art production today, whether it's literary, visual, or performative, will also have to engage with the idea of street criticism. An idea that probably didn't exist even 20 years ago, but today it's very much in our consciousness. So whether artists will have to practice self-censorship is something that they'll have to think about seriously. And if not, then what will be their preparedness for engaging with this form of response, which of course constitutes another aspect of the relation between the arts and violence. It is in this, there is this escalating intolerance and strong arm mobilization against free expression, and what Habib himself had to go through fighting back the goons. And I've been with him on some of his journeys in performing tours in Madhya Pradesh, where I've seen the police which was specially instructed by the district magistrates to protect the troupe and protect the play, would at the opportune moment just vanish and allow elements of the various fringe organizations of the Parivar to come in and disrupt the show. And Habib would send his actors backstage, wherever there was a stage. He would just ask them to retire, but would continue to stand there on stage and face whatever gali galoch was going on, whatever paper was being thrown, sometimes stones were thrown, he would face it. And once the whole things, of course, these kind of protesters, there were groups of 10, 12, 13, 15 people, they couldn't sustain it for too long, because they would manage to empty the auditoriums, and the audience would have gone. Habib would be the sole person standing on stage. But once they were gone, and once these goons then retired, Habib would continue to do the play. He would not leave the stage without finishing the play. And that kind of resistance that he offered to the attack that was coming was a very special kind of, act of courage and an act of artist that only a person with his kind of consciousness could probably have sustained. So, this strong arm mobilization against free expression, it is that kind of thing that makes me reflect today on the question of theatre and violence. And I'm grateful to the Raza Foundation and Raza Saab and Ashok Vajpayee for having instituted this annual lecture series in Habib's memory, and for having invited me to deliver this year's opening lecture. The subject itself, the title that you see there, can be playfully tossed around in a couple of ways, either as violence in theatre, or theatre that provokes violence, or as theatre in the times of violence, etc., etc., the various ways of playing with it. Depends on the way we understand theatre and the way we want to understand and construe violence. We are all aware how, in recent times, the affectivity of the arts, both visual and performative, have been overshadowed by the sheer scale of real-life spectacles magnified on the electronic media. Art seems to have been overwhelmed by life. A few days after the two planes were maneuvered into the Twin Towers in New York, the celebrated German composer Karl-Heinz von Stockhausen invited the wrath upon himself by publicly declaring, "We artists work all our lives for creating affect, for creating an impact on the person who's coming in contact with the art." However, these men with the planes produced that effect in just a few minutes. I feel my life's work has been a waste. And he was sitting in front of his own Philharmonic Orchestra, which is going to conduct a performance in front of an audience of 2,500 people. And he had come on the stage, he had picked up his baton, and he put down the baton, he made this few sentences, and he walked away, for which he was severely criticized by a lot of people in Germany. The German ambassador in Washington had to issue a formal apology to the government of the United States. Stockhausen's own daughter disowned him, saying, "What is this you are saying? You seem to be justifying that act of vandalism or the act of terrorism," whichever you want to look at it. But somehow there is a kernel of truth in that. Artists who struggle, artists who labor to create an impact, you see suddenly the impact is being somehow snatched away from below their feet through all sorts of lateral things that are happening around in society, which art doesn't seem to be able to match. And the constituency art seems to be, in one sense, floundering to find meaning, to make meaning, to find a kind of a response to this which can once again reconstitute the art object in a manner that is transformative and not in a manner that is an objectification of the idea of art. So it's a special predicament. It's something that all artists, I think, are beginning to realize, and they're beginning to be vexed by that whole situation. So by Stockhausen, by elevating that moment to the liberation, elation, transformation one experiences from an artistic effect, Stockhausen brought us face to face with the current phase of decline in the performing arts, where violent events on the streets overshadow anything that, say, something like theatre can propose. This dance of violence is accompanied by two related phenomena. One is the rise of what I would call the economy of the mass, the big populace, the mass. The other is the rise of the economy of fear. Fear of the mob within, fear of the terrorist outside, and a general fear of the other marks the circulation of our global economies. It was Albert Camus who categorized the 17th century as a century of mathematics, the 18th century as a century of physical sciences, the 19th century as that of biology, and the 20th century as a century of fear. This, of course, has now come to rest today on the precarious idea of the long nuclear night of mutually assured destruction. Technology has accelerated turbo-capitalism. Speed now contributes a new edge to politics. The speed of light of the ubiquitous media means the power to move enthralled hordes. This breakneck speed contributes both to a new erotics and the frequent panic attacks in the masses, associated with a deep depression marked by the routines of everyday life. Constant exposure to the cathode screen and other electronically lit screens seems to create a condition of retinal detachment tantamount to a shut eye. The more eyeballs the visual media grabs, the less we seem to see. Representative democracy is then threatened by the very broadcasting tools that were to shape the standardized economy of public opinion, as a prelude to a landing in the synchronized democracy of public emotion. It is some sort of an accelerated cathode reality which revels in an endless funeral procession of repeat disasters, even as it earns TRPs from showing close-up the aeropolitics of mass extermination by remote-controlled devices. Faced with this avant-garde mass terrorism celebrated on TV screens, the question is, what recourse or alternative can the theatre forms claim? And this, by theatre here, I would mean, again, all forms of the art, whether it's visual art, whether it's dance, whether it's music. I mean, what is the antidote to this mesmerizing visual that is enveloping us? TV has now almost replaced combat sports, and itself battles with the apathy of televiewers who expect the unexpected alone to wake them out of their lethargy, out of the attention deficit that has replaced vigilance in them. It is an era, it is a TV era that can be categorized as the age of the reclining man, a universal bedridden invalid. It is in such a context that one needs to posit the growing irrelevance of the theatre form as compared to the massive movement it was hardly 60 years ago. I mean, theatre meant something to us. During the time when Habib Saab and his colleagues appeared with the idea of a new theatre in India in the early 1960s, it was like a kind of a renaissance of a kind. People were acting, they were performing, they were writing, there was music coming in, there was research into the folk forms, there was a connection from across the country, a kind of a trans, north, south, east, west dialogue was going on. And it seemed like theatre had a possibility, had a transformative moment. And most of us who are the age that I'm in now remember that time as something that affected us, something that constructed us, something that molecularly sort of built our consciousness. That is something that you will now search for and really wonder from where this is going to come and how this is going to be restored. It seems the main issue people are preoccupied with today is how to make yourself visible. This need for self-representation is what seems to be driving new developments in media and technology. It might be a trifle perverted per se to dub this as democratic. For example, and it's a grim story, what happened in Gujarat during the riots. Riots is the wrong word, it's actually kind of genocide that happened, where we all know that even in very small villages now there are videographers who film marriages and who film local events and so on. In Gujarat, during those 4 nefarious days, videographers in small villages, let alone towns and cities, even in small villages, they were commandeered to film the assaults and aggression that was going on. And these filmed versions are now available in the video lending libraries across the state. And on a bad evening, when you had a bad day in office, you can go to that video lending library, borrow that thing, go and sit at home and watch that perpetration of murder, rape, violence that happened as a kind of enjoyment. And this is the kind of peculiar social context within which we are existing. Can theatre replace this? Can theatre provide this this titillation, this completely, one can again use the word turbocharged sort of blood pulsing excitement? No. So the whole question of what becomes our new forms of entertainment or new forms of visuality is, I think, something we need to put our minds to and figure out, because this is repeated. This is repeated in Guwahati, in Mangalore, in Pune, wherever women have been, for example, sexual violence has been inflicted, there has been a recording machine. And this recording machine has then been used to, transmit all those scenes of violence across. And we seem to have become consumers of a particular kind of this kind of day-to-day drama that is going on around us. So mob violence designed for the camera is enabled by the democratic ubiquity of the instruments of production itself. So that's the irony of the whole situation. Artistic effect is increasingly today a war of images, and the bio-digital picture has emerged as a technical frontier of image production and circulation. A new virulent life, going viral, a new virulent life has been afforded to these images, like for example the ones of torture from the Abu Ghraib prisons, through the internet and other media. These have become biomorphic as they clone themselves and circulate with incredible rapidity, sometimes reversing their meaning and almost setting up a trauma industry. In the throes of this constantly manufactured trauma, what can be our attitude to works of artistic production that do not talk back? Walter Benjamin, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century for me, said that there is no document of culture that is not at one and the same time a document of barbarism. That what we consider our cultural riches today have come upon the graves, the edifices, the bloodstains of former violences, deprivations and oppressions. It is clear that to be discussing theatre, we also need to discuss broader cultural milieu within which it exists and is practiced. Obviously then, we cannot ignore the fact that there is always a story of tension and conflict underlying its practice. The question is, what do we do with this tension and conflict? Why, for example, since the demise of Habib Tanvir, one can as well write the obituary of political theatre too in India. And it's not for the dearth of themes, subjects and day-to-day material, it's all around. Just the past several weeks, for example, students in Delhi have come out on the streets in their own improvised theatre of protest and showed up the hollowness of professional theatre practice amidst us. I believe one needs to deeply question the role and function played by art and artists and their consciousness during periods of social conflict. Pablo Neruda, one of my favorite poets, in a very well-known poem of his called "I'm Explaining a Few Things," after describing all the perfidies and miseries of the civil war in the small country he came from, says, and you will ask, why doesn't his poetry talk of the birds and the trees of his native land? This is a question you can ask a poet. Why is your imagery about conflict and about oppression and stuff like that? Why aren't you talking about trees and volcanoes and mountains and so on, and star and moon? His response is, come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Can an artist turn her eyes away from this? Question mark. And the invocation is not to see the blood in a voyeuristic sense. You don't need to wallow in it. You have to go towards it to recover something. Recover a larger principle, a larger moral. We know for a fact that there is a principle of survival within nature. But this cannot be interpreted as a naturalization of violence. Because at the same time, there is no principle of oppression in nature. That is an entirely man-made concept. You can never say that the tiger oppresses the deer or the boar. The tiger or the lion goes to feed just like every other bioorganic system in the universe goes to feed. That doesn't become oppression. That cannot be held up as violence in nature. So we need to be wary of constructions of cultural theory which come from a position of naturalization. Unfortunately, many of our performative disciplines which have not had the rigor of critical discourse, and I'm saying this with some emphasis, our performing forms still await rigorous critical discourse. They have been very comfortable claiming that this is our old tradition, this is God-given, and this is completely taken for granted, which leads to a kind of naturalized acceptance of violence. It is very important, therefore, to ensure that we do not culturalize violence. And along with this, it's also very important to re-look at the new audiences that are emerging and the needs of this audience and the thrust of this kind of audience formation. What are the new processes and products of the spectacle economy and the fact that everything is getting dramatically spectacularized? And how what does not fit into the spectacle seems to be so boring and so uninteresting. We need to consider seriously how theatrical and performative forms in fact become like a mask, become like a cover to sort of distance the social violence that is actually amidst us, inside which we are embedded. And the need, therefore, to look for forms that will seriously expose this, uncover the mask. It is a call of the times that artists need to perform the function of unmasking that which remains hidden below the surface. It's easy to describe violence in the arts. You can have a poem about violence, you can have a play about violence.
ये अपने साइलेंट मोड पे तो कर ही लीजिए.
You can have a mobile about violence. You can have a movie about violence, etc. But apart from such description, if you are not also proceeding to expose the face of that individual or that social force which is instigating and perpetuating that violence, making us forget our common human connections and dividing and individuating us, then you are not performing that critical task, and the work of art will remain entirely unsatisfactory. We need to look at the issues of violence as something which is a social bed of all societies, that there is a struggle for survival. At every stage of social evolution, there is also a class war, and this has produced a set of socializing mechanisms within which the violence of the powerful can get reified and masked as a natural thing. This leads to kinds of art forms of which we have a sufficient bank in this country, which is compulsively sublimative. They are in fact highly developed art forms, highly developed ways of singing and performing and acting, but all the time, all that effort goes to sublimating the violence, to mask, to put it below and make it look as if this is the way the natural order is. As against that, you will have from below, from the oppressed communities, from the oppressed societies, that is from the oppressed identities, from the identities that have hitherto been not allowed to have a voice, you will find a call for liberational violence. And you have had enough of that in this country too, and this still continues. As even Habib Tanvir's experience shows so clearly, that the voice from the margins is going to assert itself in various ways. It's curious that the rest of India can play a cricket match, but cannot write or produce a play on state violence, say in Manipur or Kashmir. And it is perfectly okay if a large majority of the population there is put under surveillance, put under curfew, put under Armed Forces Special Powers Act, etc., etc. At least 4 to 5 people are killed there every day, which never gets reported. Nobody lights candles for them. It becomes like a natural cycle of life there. So in the mainstream forms, violence appears as a kind of didacticism. It appears as a way of reassuring those who need to be reassured. And in this case, a certain class of society, that things will be okay, that divine order will be restored. There has been a certain tradition of playmaking in our country in the last 60 or 70 years, which has also corrupted the form a little bit. And that has happened through what I call the pornographic excess of showing victimhood. All the time showing people as tortured peasantry or beaten up tribals and so on. Now there is this tremendous representation of victimhood, and it has escalated even more with the growth of NGOs in different parts of the country, which are looking at issues of peasantry, landlessness, caste oppression, and so on. They seem to be thriving by creating this new theater of victimhood, which doesn't propose any aesthetic or energizing alternative. It just wallows in this self-agony of victimhood. And this triggers off the idea of violence as a spectacle. And it's into this context that we are arriving, or have already arrived in a strong way, through a device which I don't think theatre is able to handle anymore. And this is the device of hyper-realism or hyper-visuality, where the modernist idea of realism and rational discourse goes completely out of the window, and hyper-realism is a kind that you can manufacture perhaps through digital manipulation, which it takes over our visual sensibility. And this is perhaps one reason why much of theatre in India today is feeling a little bit on the back foot and shaky and not really knowing where it stands. Those who play the game immediately get absorbed into the cultural industries and become absorbed in the market. And those who stay out of it don't seem to have any logical space. It's something we need to examine a little more sharply. Hypervisuality, hyperrealism taking over all our performative genres and becoming a new kind of speed-oriented entertainment which becomes our new real experience. Since Indian theatre has not yet turned into a factory-like production, it is in the West, as it is in the West, and even now has great difficulty putting up a technically sophisticated production with lights, sound, etc. We still remain limited. Theatre as a language has not been able to deal with the new realities and concerns of our times. We seem to accept many of the things that are happening around us without asking a single question. It makes us believe. I mean, you take someone like Badal Sarkar, probably the only playwright in this country to have done something on the nuclear issue when, way back in 1968, when we hadn't even tested a bomb. But already the concern that India is going nuclear, that there is a possibility of a nuclear conflict in the region was agitating the mind of this person in 1968. How many years down the line are we since from that point? No Indian playwright, no Indian theatre has even addressed that concern. And we are on the brink of nuclear war almost every day. Something happens on LOC, both India and Pakistan talk about pulling out their armaments. But how come the theatre world or the other artist work community has not been able to come into this discourse? I think that's something we need to reflect about, that theatre as a language has not been able to deal with some of the new realities and concerns of our times. We seem to accept many of these things that are happening around us without asking any question. It makes us believers in status quo, completely accepting what is around us as natural, and takes away the sense of agency that earlier theatres seemed to provide. It is clear to me that when we now evoke Habib Tanvir, it will also be to express our need to work with the idea of theatrical disruptions. That's one of the things that Habib did with tremendous felicity, to bring in the notion of disruption through the way he choreographed his plays, the way he wrote it, the way he suddenly interjected with a song completely counter to the grain of the play at that moment, and so on. The way he structured his work, constantly disrupting the performance and giving you space to think, and at the same time giving you space to critique. We will need to develop a theory for it also. And that's the interesting part, that Habib Tanvir has come and gone, but we still don't have a theoretical study on what he represented. Such a great body of work. But where is the book? Unfortunately, Habib passed away before he could finish his autobiography. But our autobiographies and biographies are one kind of thing. But what about a study of his work? His mise-en-scène, his blocking, what was he doing? His use of, like Ashok said, the dialect. What was he searching for? Is it just worth a few articles and a few obituaries? Or is there something that we need to invest these artists with? The dignity of the serious discourse, which doesn't seem to have happened yet. I'm hoping that it will. And of course, we will need to develop a rousing pedagogy and practice around it. So just to conclude, theatre in the times of violence can only then be a theatre that recovers its agency by challenging the violence. Thank you very much for your patience.
Violence. If you have any comments, questions, you're welcome. Raise your hand. We will have the mic. You have the mic? Yes. The first one is always difficult. Then everybody joins in. So let there be someone brave enough to ask the first question.
Just one comment.
Yes. Go ahead. And please
Wait for the mic.
speak to
Block, so to say. And he said, I think, because I told him that there's a lot of crisis of new playwriting and something which connects that you're talking to the times. So he said, I think it's a worldwide phenomenon because things are changing so fast. And theatre, sort of we all understand, is a kind of art which needs reflection, which needs a distancing, which needs time to respond to a situation so that it just doesn't become propaganda. That actually it is difficult to come to get that kind of distance and yet remain profitable. Today, this seems a huge concern, what's happening, let's say the kind of sensitive. Tomorrow it changes and that seems equally momentous, and the third day something else. So as you said, that's what is happening in our world around. But I think that's also the reason why it's difficult to respond with any sense of depth and complexity. Because if we get into responding to what's happening today and what's bothering people, we are likely to get into the danger of oversimplification.
That was not a question, it was a comment.
No, but I did want to
Yes.
respond to that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you that one is not asking for agit-prop. That is not the idea. But converting personal experience into artistic material is, after all, what the artist does. And the example in theatre that comes to my mind is of this wonderful man from Manipur, Kanhaiya Lal, who got admission to the National School of Drama and didn't last there 2.5 months because he had difficulty with language. The medium of instruction was Hindi and he couldn't handle it. And within 2.5 months he had turned into a rebel, and he was coming to class and creating disruption, and he was the teachers didn't like all this, and at one point he had to leave. And which probably was one of the finest things that NSD ever did, because when he went back, he wrote a play on that experience. What did he do? He wrote a play without language, with almost gibberish. The Pebet, the play Pebet, which is all songs of the birds and songs of the foxes and so on, very minimal words in between. But in that he's talking about his own experience with the complexity of language and his inability to deal with it. And today, 40 years down the line, 45 years down the line, that play has become one of the finest anthems of decolonization in this part of the world. And it's become a textbook in the National School of Drama also. So the point is, why do you have to wait? Do you have to wait 20 years to reflect on that and create some peace? No. I think it depends on how urgent and how strong your own experience is and how you want to respond to it. So this was not agit-prop. This was just one of the finest plays that has come out of India.
My name is Raza. This is somewhere between a comment and a question. I come from a teaching, academic background, so when we are talking about theatre as a kind of space which responds to what's happening around, or responds to the times, because I see a lot of things happening within the university space, on a day-to-day basis. So I see that there is a lot of theatrical things happening within the university space. And I also see that these things are built into the responses that, especially the student world, I'm talking about the student world. So this student responses become, there is a space where you can't really separate between, these things are not separate within the university space many a time. I'm just wondering, when you're talking about theatre, you're actually talking about a kind of established, arrived at kind of theatre, when we are discussing theatre. I see that there are a lot of things happening in this country because I travel across this country to different universities and talk to students. So I see that there are a lot of things happening within the university spaces which are really not talked about at all, which are not really kind of given ample care to it's not led to the next stage because after the university term people just go away and this response is also. So this is one question, kind of wonderment that I have, why does this part which we see within the university space go away, and what is the established theatre space doing to interact with that very alive space? That's one. Secondly, it's about writing. We always tend to complain that there are a lot of things happening. We have masters, we are not really studying them, etc. Like for instance, SADANAND, who is actually very kind of one of the closest people to me, and also he is maybe he knows his work and his science and his response is much better than many other people. But I'm just wondering, maybe because of your own time and space and other activities, you're not really able to do this. So is there a
Why
way...
don't you write that book on Habib Tanvir? That's the question.
Yeah, that's of course being facile. You don't throw this question back to the questioner sort of thing.
If you have a chance, you can. To begin with your first question, I think the university space is a very special space, and many things happen there all over the world. It's like a crucible for new thoughts, new ideas, a little laboratory space, and people do many things there. But the question is, how far does it then come out and impact what is happening around the world? The one great moment we all know in history is May 68, when what the students did impacted societies, not just in the one university where they began, but across the world. A kind of a completely new consciousness emerged. That was probably a historic moment why it happened, but there is no clear answer to it. Nevertheless, we don't have too many examples of student activism continuing into a larger political movement out there in society. Why this happens? There are many theories to it, but I would say it would be very seldom when you take student work as authentic, full-blooded artistic production, because they are not doing it for their livelihood. They are not doing it for a certain kind of making impact thing. It's a project within the university campus, and these happen. But it has to be tested against audiences across different kind of parameters, and only when if it succeeds in that will you be able to draw something out of it. There are many student actors or directors or writers who graduated to become full-fledged artists themselves. But then that's a different life when they move out of the university. So I think it's a generalization to say much is happening. Of course much is happening, and that's a period in life when everybody certainly has a critical perspective. You are anti-establishment, you are anti-institution, and you do things. But that doesn't translate into what I would call
the effect, the artistic effect or the transformative effect.
I'm looking at the establishment, or I mean, if I'm just putting it, the establishment of theatre in this country, which has got a kind of mode of functioning across this country. You know, in Bombay, theatre is happening, in Delhi, theatre is happening. I'm talking about engagement, that, the arrived, that, I mean, whoever has arrived, the engagement that the establishment of theatre has, and what is the kind of engagement that you might require in order to facilitate a certain kind of movement from here to there. That is the question, right? Whether that is happening or whether, I mean, what is the rule? There is a divide. So I'm talking about that divide and the engagement which might be, which can be there, but then which I don't see it.
Yeah, I agree. Those kind of bridges, we haven't created in our universities, and how those bridges will be created will be a task. But you can see a clear division. That which is student remains student. That which is not something else. So professional practice and amateur practice is kind of almost divided like that. And when that bridge happens, when that facilitation happens, when that movement happens from the crucibles to the factories, then I think something will change. But I think theatre work, artistic work has reached a point today where it's no longer just spontaneous activity. I think there's an enormous amount of learning, reading, understanding, training, etc. that it demands, because universally the practices have become sophisticated. They've reached standards that you need to be thinking about. It's not just doing something and imagining that you have created a new, broken new ground. One has to be very much in the know of trends and politics around the world, and so I do see some wonderful work happening, say in Delhi University, Hansraj College, which has an extraordinary drama department. I mean, it's a literature department that does drama, and year after year they produce absolutely brilliant student productions, and often much better than what you see on the bigger stages and all that. But once the theatre, that group in the theatre club finishes its course, it moves out, and the figures I've got is hardly 5% goes back into theatre. The rest disperse into the larger ocean of life. So then, whether it's possible to create that continuity for them, move into theatre in a full-fledged way, because they get tremendous training here in the college itself, 3 years of solid discourse conducted by a very, very well-informed professor, etc., etc. But if that can be done, then that's a different ballgame. But otherwise, much of it is often also to get a few scores in the report card and stuff. Much is happening, but it's not necessarily that which will transform your life.
नमस्कार, अनुजा पापड़ है मेरा नाम। हिंदी में पूछूंगी क्योंकि सवाल सोच के हिंदी में हूँ। आपके लेक्चर में से लूँगी। You talked about two things, hyper realism and speed. तो मुझे ऐसा बहुत लगता है कि हम लोग सिर्फ मतलब खास सनसनीखेज घटनाओं की बात न करें जिनसे समाचार बनते हैं। हम यूं ही इतना अधिक स्पीड और इतना अधिक हाइपर रियलिज्म से एवरीबॉडी इज बीइंग बोम्बार्डेड विद दिस हाइपर रियलिज्म एंड स्पीड की ये भी अपने आप में एक तरह की सूक्ष्म हिंसा ही हो गई है, जिससे एक व्यक्ति और समाज लगातार जूझता रहता है, जिसका उन होने वाली घटनाओं से कोई संबंध हो न हो तो भी। मुझे लगता है हम लोगों को जो अदरवाइज भी इतना अधिक एक सूक्ष्म हिंसा के दौर से लगातार गुजर रहे हैं, थिएटर मुझे लगता है ज्यादा इस तरह से मदद कर सकता है कि वह मुझे एक ठहराव दे सके। जैसा आपने कहा कि हबीब तनवीर अपने नाटक में आपको एक पॉज देते हैं where you have time to think and you have time to reflect। तो मुझे नहीं लगता कि मैं चाहती हूँ ऐसा थिएटर, एज अ पर्सन जो थिएटर देखता है, पसंद करता है, कि वो थिएटर उतना ही सनसनीखेज वाक़े को उतने ही सनसनीखेज तरीके से एक प्रतिक्रिया की तरह प्रस्तुत करे। मैं चाहूँगी कि वो मुझे एक पॉज दे जहाँ मैं सोच सकूँ। सो दैट्स व्हाट आई थिंक। थैंक यू।
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, yes.
Sadanand, you've always talked of classical music as dance as non-starters when it comes to expressing the social consciousness, particularly today. Now, I want to ask you, sometimes when I'm terribly disturbed about something that's happening in this country, and I'm feeling very restless inside and don't know what to do, and I go and attend a music performance, there is something there that, is it only escapism? I mean, there is something there that gives me a sense of quietude, a sense of inner silence, which somehow the world outside seems to have snatched away from me. Then would you say that what is being done in our music and dance, you know, the sublimated art as you call it, that it is totally irrelevant?
Well, I also do what you do. I also go to music when you have to deal with the turbulence inside. But, and I would not have any quarrel with that. The issue is not what the form itself is. The issue is what we are doing with it. You know, the kind of context within which we place it, the kind of platforms it gets, and the kind of mysticism within which we shroud it. I mean, that's basically the issue that I'm raising. That we insulate it so much that it somehow seems to begin to struggle for oxygen from outside. I mean, none of the great musicians of India ever they were not like hothouse flowers or anything. They were exposed to life. They struggled in their life, and much of that pain comes into the music. And that's of course something that you'll recognize, and it's a very, very valuable treasure, and obviously you're not going to say no to that. I would have a slightly different reaction to classical dance. But classical music is because classical dance is much more of a construct. It's not something that spontaneously grew. Music has a longer lineage. But the issue is this, that it is now located in very esoteric spaces. You will not find them in the, as called getting the hands dirty. We put them on a glass house, and we don't want them to be, exposed to too many, within quotation, problems. Why that is so, one doesn't know. Why isn't this music a mass form? Why isn't it accessible to everybody? Why isn't it taught in schools? Why isn't it transmitted, more? I mean, these are questions we need to ask. Why is it kept away only for a certain elite and class society? So I mean, the issue of no art form per se, you can quarrel against it. It's perfectly valid in its own way. But I'm talking about the context within which they exist and within which social frames are constructed around it.
Is there any traditional form of music? Is there any classical music that is inside which sort of gets its hands dirty? Which has got its hands dirty?
I think classical music per se has its own repertoire, but classical musicians have got their hand dirty. I mean, we have that period in the 1940s when just about everyone was in the IPTA, and they were singing marching songs, they were singing Bengal famine songs, they were singing, everybody was there.
But that wouldn't come within the genre of traditional classical khayal music, would it?
It would come within that because they would continue into that. They would sing a rousing song and then they would continue into their alap, and you must see some of the films of that moment where they're bringing in the repertoire. Ravi Shankar, for example, was part of that. He was bringing in repertoire. After having done some chalo, otho, jago, that kind of thing, he'll bring in the repertoire. Where in some village context, in some chaupal, in some little ramshackle hut in front of 40 people. So that was happening. There was a certain, commitment is a bad word, but there was a certain engagement they were making. Giving up, recordings in All India Radio to go and do this. So that commitment is something that that space is not there. And today, if they even do it, one doesn't know what reception they would get from the other side, because it's the gap is now so wide that. For me, the great example is Harendranath Chattopadhyay. He was an extraordinary classical musician, trained with Ustad Abdul Karim Khan, and deliberately said, the time for my classical music will come. Today is the moment for doing something with people's voices and people's songs. He said that, and he would, in concert after concert, he will demonstrate a classical dhun, a particular rag he'll demonstrate, and then very quickly, within 5-6 minutes, he would turn that rag into a so-called militant tune and work with it. As artistic, as satisfactory as anything. So these are the artistic choices. You make those artistic choices.
You spoke about
they're recording it, so please give your name.
Mentioning your name, you name.
Yeah, I'm Priya Kanvi.
I'm Buddha. You spoke about the need for disruption within art forms. Now, I was wondering if the raising of art to the level of spectacle can also be a valid disruption, because I'm thinking of artists like Damien Hirst, who seem to have done that. And I was just wondering what you think about that.
I'm glad you quoted Damien Hirst. Damien Hirst, when he first did it, his very first disruption, the impossibility of the idea of life, question mark. So those disruptions, but when Damien Hirst did the disruption, he was not Damien Hirst. Today he is.
One last question, if there is any. If there isn't, thank you very much, Sadanand Menon,
Thank you.
for having raised some very important, and as we say in Hindi, jwalant prashn. And I do hope that some of those who are concerned with the present condition of the arts and their future would like to ponder over, reflect upon some of the anxieties that he has expressed. So thank you very much. Madam Menon, please write it out, not only on this, but give us a hard copy so that we can publish it. And thank you very much, all of you who have come here. Our next memorial lecture is Daya Krishna Memorial Lecture, which will be on the 7th of March. And Ananya Vajpayee, a young social scientist and thinker, will be delivering it. The topic is something to do with Ambedkar. So thank you very much. Do come at 6:30, have tea and coffee, however good or bad it is. And please allow us time to start at 7. Today you would have noticed we started a little before that.